Hey everyone, Forester Mike here. Since my last video, wildfires have continued to devastate California. In addition to the three massive fires I mentioned last time, one of which has grown to be over 1 million acres, the Creek Fire and North Complex Fire have grown large enough to make their place onto Wikipedia's list of the 10 largest fires in California history. These two fires have been especially devastating because they have burned partially in residential areas. The two of them together have destroyed over 3,000 structures. To make matters worse, the North Complex fire has resulted in 15 fatalities. I want to spend today's video getting into the finer details of forest management, because good forest management is unquestionably the path forward to solving California's wildfire crisis and preventing future tragedies like this one. And if you ask me, one key to good problem solving is to be specific. That is, if we want to solve this problem and make good policies, people need to understand what exactly we're proposing when we say forest management for fire prevention or fuels reduction. Let's talk about what it means to fireproof a forest. So here is a look at the structure of a California forest that is primed and ready for a massive wildfire. You've basically got 4 separate tiers of fuels. So going from the top down, we start with large, mature trees, the canopy. This is the part of the forest that is, quote-unquote, not supposed to burn. That is, before fire suppression, when low-intensity surface fires were extremely common, these trees would mostly survive those fires. Canopy fires were rare, and the ground fires usually wouldn't burn hot enough to kill the tree from the base. Conversely, the absolute most devastating fires that we have now occur when these trees, these large mature trees, are actively burning because they are such a rich fuel source. In many of California's forests today, the number of large mature trees is far too high for both fire safety and forest health. The second tier of fuels are small, immature trees. These are the ladder fuels and are actually the worst of the worst. They allow fires burning at the forest floor to climb all the way to the canopy and ignite the large trees. Getting rid of these is by far the most important part of fire-safe forestry. These trees can grow so dense that it can be difficult to even walk through the woods at all. Trust me, I would know. The third tier is brush, the woody shrubs that grow 3 to 6 feet in height. These can be spiny, whippy, or stiff as a board. Universally, they are unpleasant to walk through. They burn extremely readily, and unless herbicide is used, will resurge very quickly after being removed. They are massive contributors to spreading fire across landscapes, but will typically only burn hot enough to ignite large trees when you have generations of dead and live, mature brush accumulated on top of one another. Speaking of dead material, the fourth and final tier is woody debris, your twigs and down logs. Twigs obviously act as great flash fuels, but large downed logs are the real trouble. Think about it like a campfire. Once you get your big logs going, they take a very long time to burn through completely, and they put off a large amount of heat in the process. It's worth noting that it's rare to find a forest with all 4 tiers completely present. At lower elevations, for example, you typically only have tiers 2, 3, and 4. The point, however, is that these forests present a solid wall of burnable material. Anywhere you stand, you've got fuels to your left, to your right, below you, above you, and even high above you. Fire could spread in any direction, becoming more and more intense as it gets to larger and larger fuels. Thus, the fundamental goals of fire-safe forestry are twofold. 1, to break up the fuel continuity, and 2, to reduce the total quantity of the fuel. It's great if you can do both, but doing one is extremely useful on its own. Okay, now that we understand that, let's talk about the principal ways fuels reduction is performed. One of my most fun jobs as a forester is figuring out which treatments work best for each unique forest situation. There are 4 principal treatments, each of which can address different fuel tiers. The first is prescribed fire, which can address tiers 3 and 4. That's the brush and downed woody material. The second is mastication, which can address tiers 2, 3, and 4. The third common method is hand thinning, which can address Tier 2, the latter fuels. And the fourth is logging, which can address both the latter fuels and the large mature trees. We'll start with prescribed fire, or broadcast burning, as it is sometimes called. This is basically the process of lighting an intentional low-intensity surface fire to spread through a designated area and eliminate small fuels. Many people view this strategy as something of a panacea. After all, if the problem is lack of fire, then simply reintroducing fire in a controlled manner should get the job done. And while prescribed fire is unquestionably useful for eliminating small woody debris and brush, it unfortunately doesn't work as a cure-all. There are several reasons for this. First, and most obviously, fire is dangerous. Broadcast burning must be done in low wind and higher humidity conditions so that the fire is unlikely to burn too hot or get out of control. Of course, the weather can't be too wet either, or the fire won't burn at all. These conditions typically occur only sporadically during winter and spring, rendering the window for this type of treatment quite small. In particular, high elevation areas are covered in snow for much of winter and spring, and so the opportunities for broadcast burning are even fewer and further between. Another problem with this method is that it does little or nothing to address tiers 1 and 2 of fuels. In a successful broadcast burn, over 90% of large trees will survive. Smaller trees, the tier 2 trees, may be killed, but a fire that is hot enough to consume and actually eliminate the residual wood from those trees is also hot enough to kill large trees and potentially get out of control. Lastly, the liability laws in California make broadcast burning exceptionally risky. If a company performing a broadcast burn were to accidentally lose control of it and cause property damage or loss of life, they would be held liable, regardless of whether or not they were negligent or followed best practices. This means very few entities are willing to actually do broadcast burning at all. Moving on to mastication. A masticator is basically a large rotating cylinder with blunt teeth mounted on the front of a skid steer or cat, or supported on a boom. These machines are excellent for grinding up large woody debris, brush, and small trees into harmless wood shavings. The small trees must really be small, though. Grinding up trees over 10 inches in diameter with a masticator can be extremely time-consuming. The result of a good mastication job looks like a beautiful, newly mulched park. And getting to watch a masticator munch through a forest is honestly one of the more entertaining parts of my job. However, mastication can be extremely tricky on rocky soils, as hitting a rock with a masticator head can result in the breaking off of a tooth, which is costly to repair and results in a lot of machine downtime. Moreover, masticating brush without using herbicide typically has extremely short-lived efficacy, as brush can resprout and grow extremely tall in a matter of a few years. Next, we have hand thinning, which is primarily meant to address Tier 2 fuels. Essentially, a crew with chainsaws will walk through the forest and manually cut down all the small trees. It's pretty straightforward. The trick is what to do with those trees once they are cut. Some crews will cut the material up into smaller pieces and assemble it into dome-shaped piles. Then, during the wet season, the crew comes back and burns the piles. Another solution I have seen is to have a tracked chipper move through the woods with the crew. As trees are cut, they are loaded into the chipper, and the chips are broadcast across the forest floor, creating a similar aesthetic to mastication. At the end of the day, both methods are extremely effective at eliminating ladder fuels and disrupting fuel continuity. The main downside of hand thinning is that, due to the need to pay an entire crew, it is much costlier than mastication, running up to $2,000 per acre. Finally, we have my personal favorite of the methods, logging. Even when all Tier 2, 3, and 4 fuels have been removed, logging is still often a necessary step for fireproofing a forest. I talked briefly in my last video about clear cuts as a form of fuels reduction, but I'm not going to expand much upon that here. I think that topic is complex and rich enough to warrant its own video. Instead, I want to focus on selection cuts, the typical prescription carried out on U.S. Forest Service lands, which make up about 60% of California's forests. Selection cuts are basically designed to make it very hard for a crown fire to spread throughout the forest. This is accomplished firstly by removing more than half the trees in the forest, trucking them to a mill, and converting them to wood products. Easier said than done. Of the 4 fuels reduction methods discussed in this video, logging by far removes the most flammable material from the forest. This is absolutely critical, as any forest which has enough material for a profitable selection logging job is the most dangerous type of forest to leave vulnerable to a wildfire. When a forest like that begins actively burning, there's little that can be done to stop it. Selection cuts on Forest Service lands are also designed to severely disrupt fuel continuity. The spacing of uncut, or residual, trees is purposefully made to be very uneven. Clumps of large trees and then large open areas are distributed throughout the stand, forming natural breaks in fuel continuity and depriving fire of easy paths to spread or gain intensity. So there you have it, the primary methods of fireproofing California's forest. If I had to pick a favorite, I would definitely have to go with forests that have been selection logged, had their small trees piled and burned, and then had the logging debris and masticated. These are truly resilient forests to all but the most of intense and roaring fires, and they look absolutely gorgeous. My opinions aside, our goals as a state over the coming decades have to be on figuring out how to apply these methods, or some of the other less common ones, to 33 million acres of forests in a timely manner, and then maintain them in their treated condition. I have some thoughts on that matter that I'll share in a future video. In the meantime, if you learned something today, please consider subscribing. And the next time you're in the woods, remember to tip your forester on the way out.